Welcome and thank you for being here today. Through the B.U.I.L.D.S project, we have partnered with 4 stakeholder partners who will be conducting a 4-part webinar series. This video serves as a self-paced learning tool, providing B.U.I.L.D.S organizations with educational content in an easy-to-find and consumable format on topics related to strengthening their organizational and service capacity in the settlement sector. Diversity recognizes that our work takes place on the ancestral, traditional, and unceded territories of the Semiahmoo, the CHASI, Coquitlam, Kwantlen, Kaikia, Musqueam, and the Tsawwassen First Nations. The knowledge, traditions, and ongoing contributions of these communities are significant in providing context to the work we do, and diversity recognizes the importance that reconciliation has in building truly inclusive and strong communities. The B.U.I.L.D.S project is funded by Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada, and we are grateful to IRCC for supporting this important work in the settlement sector. We are honored to have Chelsea Klassen from the Community Health and Social Innovation Hub lead today's session. She will be discussing research, data collection, and how to access funding opportunities when looking to expand your research idea. Following the presentation, Chelsea has provided resources for further reading that will be included in a resource guide.
Hi, my name is Chelsea Klassen, and I'm the lead researcher at the Community Health and Social Innovation Hub at the University of the Fraser Valley. In this session, we're going to go over how to undertake research and data collection with a community-oriented approach. The first part we're going to discuss is why research is important and why we would want to take a community-oriented approach. Additionally, we will discuss how your organization can take a community-based approach to research. The content in this webinar and in the resource guide is provided for general informational purposes only and does not constitute legal or any other professional advice or opinion of any kind. So, how do we understand the communities that our organizations might be serving? Understanding the communities that organizations serve is a very important part of community work. One important tool that organizations can use to understand the communities they serve is research. Western Sydney University defines research as the creation of new knowledge and/or the use of existing knowledge in a new and creative way, so as to generate new concepts, methodologies, and understandings. This would include the synthesis and analysis of previous research to the extent that it leads to new and creative outcomes. Understanding the value of research is important, and without a solid understanding of the value of research and what it can contribute to our organizations, we may not be making the most of the research opportunities that we have. Research is important because it can help us to better understand the populations we're serving. Additionally, research often leads us towards different solutions. It can also help light a path to demonstrate what has and hasn't worked in other settings. And finally, good research can track changes over time, which can both lead to improved programming as well as giving us a story about how we've seen different issues change over time. Research can also help us answer really challenging questions and give us a better idea of some of the solutions. So, for example, we at the Community Health and Social Innovation Hub, also known as CHASI, recently, by recently I mean a year ago, completed a report looking at the social impacts of the Abbotsford Atmospheric River event, or the Abbotsford flood. Archway Community Services, a large community organization located in Abbotsford, came to us and really wanted to understand what could organizations do differently next time when a large natural disaster strikes. And so the questions that Archway came to us with are, what are the social impacts of a natural disaster? And what are the needs of my specific community when a natural disaster strikes? We were able, as I'll talk later, to use a mixed methods approach to support Archway and, of course, wider community with answering these important questions. That's the role that research can play in supporting us answering those types of questions. So historically, academic research, which is often research coming from an institution like a university or college, has a history of being marginalizing equity-seeking groups. So it's really important for your research to be as supportive of groups because of this history. We want to ensure that we're supporting groups and not just being extractive of their expertise. Even though sometimes that extractive nature and really taking information and not giving a lot back is maybe not overt or not intended, often academic research can have that approach. And so when you're doing research with your organization, if you're connecting with different groups, such as an institution, or connecting with other community serving organizations, you want to be ensuring that you're connecting with organizations that share similar values to you. So it's really important when we're talking about community-based research to strengthen and forge those connections and relationships. Building trust is really an important first step. So looking at organizations that serve similar populations and looking at how they've continued and do build bridges with their populations they serve, as well as other organizations. It's important when you're looking as well at connecting with different institutions that you're looking for research groups that are receptive to your specific needs and your specific questions. So a research group or organization that comes in and is not interested in hearing the types of questions and things that you're really interested in learning about might not be the right fit for you, because at your organization, you're probably looking to answer really specific questions that will help your organization grow and strengthen. So you're really looking for groups that will support your specific questions and that want to have that mutual relationship and mutual respect and conversation. You're going to also be seeking organizations, be that institutional or other community organizations, that have established trust and connections within the community. This is a really good way to forge relationships, because you're looking at their reputation and how they've traditionally treated others, both in their communities they're serving, as well as external to those communities. Another important step is looking for researchers that understand the insider-outsider conversation. So researchers, if they're good researchers, they should understand that they're coming at it with their specific approach, and they may not have the lived experience of the community members that you're serving. So that's not a fault of the researcher. The researcher will come with their specific skills that will be valuable for the research, but they should understand that they have an outsider perspective, provided they don't have their own lived experience. And so what we want to do with an external researcher, as well as with our community organization, is recognize that the lived experience is valuable, but also understand that the research methodology that the researcher is providing, when we put the lived experience with the research methodology, we can get a really robust understanding of the situation that's going on, and subsequently, hopefully find solutions that will help tackle some of the important issues that your organizations are facing. So an important first step in the research process is to look at what already exists. So before or as you're kind of coming up with your problem, it's really important to see what already exists out there. We often call this a literature review, but that doesn't mean it has to just be literature. There's lots of different media modalities that we can find good information from. You might start with journal articles. You might start with news articles. You might look at different UN reports or other nonprofit reports in your area, or podcasts, documentaries. These are all things that can shed light on specific issues. So, for example, if you're looking at something that's evolving quite quickly, the peer-reviewed journal process often takes a long time to get journal articles through. So you might not be able to have a good understanding of the issue if you purely look at just peer-reviewed journal articles. So you're really going to want to look at accessing different types of resources that could help shed a bit of light on your issue. And so that's a good place to start. And then we'll talk more about the research process once you kind of have done that literature review. And that's kind of where you can start forming what your research might look like. Another reason why you might be interested in collecting data is to try to explain your program. By explain your program, I mean you may want to justify why you should be eligible for a grant or why you should get a grant, and data can provide some of that justification. So if you're looking at how many people accessed your service, what were the demographics of the people that accessed your service, and there's a specific grant that's targeting a main demographic of your service provision, collecting data might provide that additional support as to why you should be eligible for that grant. Collecting data can happen in many ways. Often with service organizations, there's two ways. So you may have an intake or exit form type of data, or you might also conduct more targeted research with your clients. If you're doing regular data collection, which would include kind of that intake or exit form, you might want to consider what is the best time to collect this data? And what data do I want to collect that will help strengthen my application for a grant? There's lots of tools we can use, and I'll provide additional resources in the resource document and additional content in the resource document. But some of the tools that you can use to collect data, of course, would be a case records management system, which you probably already have. You can use Google Forms. That's another mechanism you can use that you could do to conduct a survey. Or SurveyMonkey is another one that is commonly used. What's really important is once you've solidified how you're going to do this intake or exit form data, you really want to create an easy system whereby you can convert that data you've collected into a database. It doesn't require, something very sophisticated and not user-friendly. There's actually many ways that you can create databases that can concentrate this data and also be very easy to use. So one that we find frequently is used is using Microsoft Excel to create a very user-friendly database. So now we're going to go over some general guidelines on collecting demographic data. One of the first questions that we want to ask is it necessary to collect information concerning these demographic variables to achieve my purpose? So is this data really going to be a part of my data analysis? If you're not going to have a specific purpose to using the data, it's probably not important for you to collect it. Many people are inundated with requests for data, as I'm sure everyone watching this video has been at some point. And so we really want to thoroughly analyze why we're collecting the data we're collecting. So is age really important? Is ethnicity very important? Part of determining why you might want to collect the data will be what is the purpose of it, right? So what is the purpose that you're trying to achieve with collecting the data? So is it for a granting purpose? Are you using this to leverage grants, and particularly grants that might be targeting a specific equity-seeking group or a specific age group or a specific gender? So in that case, it might be important for you to collect that kind of information and data. If not, then you might want to rethink why am I collecting that data? Is this really going to add value to to the data that I have and to my purpose? Another important question, another guideline is, are my questions inclusive? So You'll see in the resource guide some examples of potential categories, but when we're thinking about inclusive questions, we want to be really mindful of people's important parts of identity. Often demographic data collection is tied to identity. And so are we being exclusive or inclusive with our questions? And are our questions still giving us that level of information that we need, right? So if we want a level of specificity, if we need a specific age of somebody rather than an age category, how are we designing our questions to ensure we're getting that specific information? So when we're thinking about inclusive questions, we want to think about terminology. So for example, when we're thinking about older adults, that terminology, if we look at research, has been shown to be better received by older adults, okay? So instead of using something like elderly or senior, using older adults is a more maybe reflective term that we can use. So every organization that serves specific populations will have their understanding of what's appropriate. Different government agencies, there are best practices, which you'll see in the resource guide, but really we want to think about what is going to make the most sense with respect to being inclusive of our clients and who we're serving, and clear, right? So getting that specificity of the data that we need, right? So understanding that is really important. When we're thinking about demographic data, we also want to think about, should I offer a response option such as prefer not to answer, right? Do we want to not collect any data? Do we want to make it a requirement that people must answer a question? We'll talk about this as well in the ethics section, but you might want to have that as an option. Perhaps people might not feel comfortable disclosing specific parts of their identity. And so having a response option such as prefer not to answer can provide a way for people to still give some information that they want to disclose, but not disclose the information they're not comfortable sharing with you. So now we're going to talk about some of the various research methodologies that might be useful for your organization. The term methodology is a long word, but really what it's talking about is the process as well as the tool that you're going to use to conduct the research that you are doing. So there's a lot of different methodologies and different tools that we can use to conduct research. So I'll list a couple here. So the first one is really Indigenous research methodology. And this is a specialized methodology, and it's very applicable in many different ways. But generally speaking, it might have specific use if you're serving an Indigenous population primarily with your organization, because it can often be reflective of cultural practices and that way. So some research methodologies specific to Indigenous populations would include storytelling, sharing circles, art creation, and so forth. So I would strongly suggest if you are Indigenous led or Indigenous serving organization that you learn more about specific Indigenous research methodologies. There's many great resources out there. We will have a few in the resource document you can look at. But and again, if you're interested in those methodologies, even if you don't serve Indigenous population, their methodologies can also be very culturally relevant to other types of groups. Another research method that is taking a bit more, or has become a bit more popular in recent years, is community-based participatory research. And this really looks at people with lived experience participating in creating the research. And this is probably a very useful approach that your organization can take. It's very collaborative. It really tries to serve as a tool to have more equity involved in research and equity between different researchers, stakeholders, community members, and really integrating everybody into the process. And it also is the focus and kind of purpose of this method of research is really to be action-oriented and create positive and lasting social change. So if that sounds like a methodology that would be useful for your organization, again, we'll have links in the resource document that you can look to. So two of the main branches of research that is used frequently are quantitative and qualitative research. And a lot of the description is in the name. So quantitative research really looks at amounts or quantities. And when we're talking about quantitative research, we're generally talking about numbers. So we're looking at and using surveys. That's a main way to conduct quantitative research, or looking at other numerical data sources. On the other hand, when we have qualitative research, that of course looks more at quality. And that's not to say quantitative research isn't quality, but qualitative research really tries to be additive, tries to, explain the what. So if we're thinking about the quantitative research as telling us the what, the amount, how many people, or who was there, the qualitative research will tell us the why, perhaps, or the how, okay? So if we go back to the Abbotsford Flood Report example, we developed a survey in conjunction with Archway that looked at what services people access. So we could tell you kind of what services people accessed, when they might have accessed the services, as well as some of the demographic data around who was accessing it. For our qualitative research, we did two kind of methodologies, which were interviews, which is, having a conversation with somebody, and focus groups, which is groups of people, and you usually associate that, there's some kind of association with that group. So for us, we divided up our focus groups to look at social impacts by dividing them up into kind of service sectors. So we did a mental health specific focus group. We did a organizations serving unhoused people specific focus group. And so by having both that understanding from the survey and the quantitative perspective partnered with that qualitative understanding, we were able to provide and paint a more robust picture of what was happening. So, who was accessing services? Well, primarily, it was people that had family locally that were able to perhaps stay with that family locally, which is, intuitive, but also what the data can do is really speak to what you might know intuitively, but it also can shed light on things that you might not have realized. So you might not have realized, like I did, that from our understanding and from our research, we were able to see that really the community groups were very quick at responding compared to the government. And that's not surprising, but it was really exposed in both the surveys and the interviews and focus groups that we did, right? So people spoke about the red tape that government has to go to respond versus community organizations and community groups. While they're still, of course, adhering to principles, they were able to respond much more rapidly because they didn't have to go through so much bureaucracy. Okay, so that helped us kind of understand the context that the organizations were working in, what was working well. We did some investigations into and research, into the evacuation shelters that people were going to. So they went to TradeX in Abbotsford, and we were able to find that through our interviews and focus groups that people who had different cultural preferences really weren't able to access the food that they wanted, right? Or that they were culturally used to. So that was one thing for next time. The next time there's a response, it's very imperative that we have a cultural focus to ensure that people are taken care of. So that's just an example of how you can use this kind of community-based research to expose and really identify issues. And of course, it's nothing new that there's not cultural responses to particular things, but what the research was able and could be used by organizations is to say, look, this was a problem, so next time there's a disaster, we have this in place to respond appropriately, and that can allow those organizations to obtain funding. So those kind of two methodologies, I just showed you a way that we married them. And I will link the flood report in the resource document, so if you would like to read further as to some of the findings, you can. But you can really see how by getting an understanding of who was affected, and what were some of the services people were accessing, as well as some of the bigger issues, you can really connect those two types of methodologies to more fully answer the question that you're asking. So when we're talking about research, a really key part of research is ethics. I understand that each organization will have their specific requirements with respect to data and ethics, and I would urge you that it's imperative to follow all regulations, rules, and laws with respect to people's information and who has access to that. So I implore you to please ensure that you're following those rules. If we're talking from a more kind of breadth of perspective, when we're talking about consent and ethics, we really want to ensure that our participants have given their consent to us using their data from a research perspective. So we actually don't even ensure we must do that. Specifically, for example, so I work at University of the Fraser Valley. Because we're a government-funded organization, we are bound to follow the TCPS 2 ethics rules. And so I will have that link in the resource document for you to look at more, but this is a very stringent kind of requirement that all all research projects must go through this ethics procedure when they're going through our institution. And so one of the things that we really want to ensure that we're doing is consent. So there are 4 pillars of consent that we want to make sure that we're abiding by and we're being respectful of. The first one is decision capacity. So are people deciding to contribute to your research with their own capacity? Okay, so I know this may be, there's some issues when it comes to like a child, but follow the rules and regulations that are in your particular organization or that your particular organization follows. But really, we want to make sure that if we're just talking about adults here, that their decision capacity is there to agree to participate in your research. Another important thing we have to do is document their consent. So traditionally, this looks like a signed consent form that outlines all the different benefits and risks of research, which we'll talk about that a little bit later. And so when we're talking about documenting consent, we're often traditionally talking about signing a consent form. That is not always the only way that we can obtain consent. For example, I did research in Afghanistan, and one of the ways that you obtained consent there from a cultural perspective was verbally. So people, from a cultural perspective, signing something was much less common. It wasn't understood to be a research kind of perspective. So what you would do is you would get verbal consent. So that might be another way that you ensure that you're documenting the consent, is that you've gotten verbal consent of those individuals. So it's important to look at the cultural norms of the population you're doing research with to really understand what might be appropriate in this circumstance, and can they understand what we're doing. Disclosure is another one. So it's really important to disclose how you're going to use the information, what's the purpose of the information that you're going to be collecting, and how are you going to use it? What are some of the potential benefits to the participants? So often in research, we talk about the benefits and the risks of the research. So for the flood research, if we take that example, the benefits are, as I would hope, improve service delivery, right? So the idea is we can use this information that we're collecting to improve service delivery and help have stronger responses to natural disasters in the future. So that's a potential benefit. Additionally, sometimes when we do research, we will provide maybe an honorarium or a gift card, some kind of financial incentive to participants for their time, right? So it's basically honoring that they're taking the time to speak with me for half an hour, an hour. It's kind of that acknowledgement, right? So we have to disclose that could be another benefit. Maybe you have funding to give. You're going to interview 10 of your community members that you're serving in your organization, and you're going to give them a $25 gift card or something. That would be another benefit you would want to disclose, so that's clear at the outset. On the flip side, when we're thinking about disclosure, we also have to think about the risks, okay? So it's really important to highlight what are some of the risks. Often, if we're talking about issues that may be sensitive to folks or talking about difficult times, difficult circumstances, we want to disclose that there's the potential risk that this could bring up emotions that will be challenging. We always, when we're dealing with research of this nature, and most of the research that I do at CHASI is of this kind of nature. For example, the flood brought up a lot of emotions. That was a very difficult time for people, emotionally, financially, physically. And so we had a notice that, this could bring up difficult mental health issues, could bring up issues that could impact your mental health. And so we had a list of resources that people could reach out to. We also do kind of a debrief at the end of our interviews, which is an important thing, just going over potential supports that people could reach out to. And so, the flood research actually was quite emotional. We had a lot of people who were impacted by that. And so disclosure is super important. You have to make sure that people feel like they have a full understanding of what you are going to be talking about, right? So the topic is clear, the purpose of your research is clear. The final pillar is competency, and that just is ensuring, it's similar to capacity, just ensuring that you have the ability and the full understanding of the benefits, the risks associated with why you might be part of this research. So altogether, with these 4 pillars, decision capacity, documenting of consent, disclosure, and competency, all together, if your research participants have that understanding, it's generally considered that you will be conducting ethical research, and we really want to be conducting ethical research. So from a research ethics perspective, we can kind of see the data that an organization might have in 2 ways. There is the case records management or other data that you may have collected, and then there's research data you might undertake. Again, I implore you to please follow any rules, regulations, or laws, particularly pertaining to people's information that you may be obtaining. But again, from a wider perspective, we really want to think about ethics, confidentiality, and anonymity, and how we're using the data. So when we're thinking about ethical data collection, we also want to ensure that we're being responsible with respect to confidentiality and anonymity. So keeping people's particularly personal details private is very important as part of the research process, particularly the type of research that we're doing. If you want to maybe publish data or get data more out into the world and use it more kind of externally facing, it's really important that you are respectful of confidentiality and anonymity of individuals, especially if you're doing the research process to answer that research question you might have come up with. If you're using the case records management data, it's still also very important that you follow the rules of your organization. That information, if it's aggregated, so if it's we served 500 people breakfast, that would be a good way to use the data and use it for grants or that type of thing. So what's really important is, depending on your specific organization and your data regulations, you need to make sure you're keeping in mind as much as you can the deference to confidentiality and anonymity. I would strongly urge you, if you are thinking of conducting research through your organization or with community partners, to look at the Government of Canada's TCPS2 ethics certification. It is a free certification that anyone can do at any time. And again, that link will be in the resource document. Strongly suggest you undertake that, because that provides a very robust understanding and kind of covering of what research ethics is. As I've stated, and I think I'll just say it one more time because it's really important, including the benefits and risks of the research is really imperative. So, because this can really have an impact on whether or not someone wants to participate. It can either act as a kind of deterrent from someone participating if they know the data will be used in one way, or it can really support them wanting to contribute and feel like they're giving their story in a good way. So when we're thinking about confidentiality, anonymity, particularly with respect to interviews and more qualitative research, we really want to do our best to do confidentiality and anonymity. So that means giving someone a pseudonym. That means, removing any very personal information from the research record, such as perhaps maybe they disclose their address, phone number, that type of thing. That doesn't need to be there. What we really want to do is distill the research down so that it can provide a wider part of the story without compromising someone's confidentiality. So it's really important. Again, each organization will have their specific requirements with respect to information, but if you do conduct research, try to follow TCPS2 research etiquette. So when you're creating a survey, there's a couple survey questions and ways that we phrase questions that we want to be mindful of avoiding or ensuring we're doing our best to not have those happen. So I'm going to go over a couple of them here. The first one is the leading question. So an example of a leading question would be, how great is our hardworking customer service team? The word great and hardworking both kind of lead us to a conclusion. If you answer that question, it's kind of implied that you're agreeing that the hardworking customer service team is in fact hardworking and great. So when you're looking at trying to collect data around your organization's services, rather than using words like great or hardworking, you might want to ask a question like, how would you describe your experience with our team or with the blank service team, okay? So that allows for people to describe their experience. Now, you could use that, describe their experience on a scale from, we often use something called a Likert scale, which is 1 to 5. So you could say, how would you describe your experience? Was it very bad to very good? That will give, and then neutrals in the middle. That will give people the ability to express how they feel about the experience rather than you kind of putting that on them. So that would be an example of a leading question. You want to try to avoid questions like that. Another question would be a loaded question. So that's where you have qualifying information associated. So a leading question would be, where do you enjoy drinking coffee? The problem with that is that the loaded qualifying component, the loaded qualifying component would be that the person drinks coffee. Okay, so you want to try to rather ask, do you drink coffee? Yes or no. And if the person says yes, you might say, where do you find yourself drinking coffee? Okay, so trying not to load the question with associations. You want to rather not assume anything about the person taking the survey. Another issue that often comes up with survey question is double-barreled questions. That's where you're asking multiple things in one in one specific question. So in this case, you really would want to proofread your questions. So you're checking for ands or ors. So are you worried about crime and security? Okay, so you might rather ask, are you worried about crime? Are you worried about security? We generally don't want to group things together because that can be asking multiple things and doesn't really give you the full picture. So that's called a double-barreled question. We generally want to avoid that. Another important thing that we want to do with our survey questions is try to refrain from using jargon. Okay, so your organization may have specific jargon. It's generally good if you're not sure if people will have a wide enough understanding of the jargon. You're generally wanting to make sure that you're giving a description. So acronyms, it's generally good to spell it out and then provide the acronym. So United Nations, bracket UN. Okay, so we don't want to assume that folks know the full acronym. But of course, if people are more familiar with the acronym, that gives kind of both individuals the understanding. Another term might be, even methodology. That could be a word that people aren't familiar with the definition. Sometimes you might need to define jargon, but generally, if you can try to make it simple because we want people to understand our surveys and understand our questions. Another issue, as I was talking about with scales, is overlapping scales. So an example of this is often seen with ages. So you might ask, how old are you? Are you 18 to 30 as one category? Are you 30 to 50 as another category? Are you 50 to 70? And what the problem is when you have 30 in both categories. So if you were 30 years old, which category would you respond to? That can create confusion. So when you're editing your survey questions, you really want to make sure, okay, am I including categories or having overlapping categories in my survey? So you'd want to do 18 to 29, 30 to 49, etc. Okay, so you really want to review for that. Another important one is double negatives. So we want to try to avoid double negatives as much as possible to make sure that it's clear. And finally, with our survey questions, particularly if we're using a scale, we want it to be aesthetically and logically clear. So is it pleasing? Is it clear? Do we have a clear indication of what the scale is that we're asking and answering? We don't want it to be too difficult for people to read the survey and understand the survey. So I'm going to go over a simplified version of the research process with you. Many researchers go to school for a number of years to learn about research methodology. And so we want to value that it is a science, and it is probably good if you're able to partner with somebody who has research methodology skills. But that said, there are lots of things that service organizations can glean from research methodology and put them into practice for the best use for their organization. When we're talking about the research process, there's usually a couple steps that we follow, and they're not always linear, but generally it's a bit of a process. And so usually the first one is observing, right? As we've talked about, you'll notice maybe a new demographic accessing your services or a new issue cropping up with the people that you're serving. And so once you start those observations, that's usually going to kind of spring some questions and spring some ideas to mind. The next step of the research process would be really identifying the purpose. So why are you going to undertake this research? Is it to improve your service provision? Is it to investigate why are we seeing so many more women accessing this particular service? That could be just an example. So you're really going to identify the purpose and why are you conducting the research that you're conducting? Then you're going to design a research plan, right? So you're going to come up with what types of methodology might work best for you. You're going to talk about what your research questions might include, right? So what do I want to answer? Let's say, for example, you're seeing more women accessing your services. You might want to say, I'm going to talk to some of those women that are accessing the services and find out why have they started accessing the services? Or perhaps you want to improve your services, and so you're going to look at interviewing people you're already providing services to and finding out what additional services they would like to have. So you're going to design your research plan. That's the third step. Then the fourth step, that is really collecting the data. So this is where you have to design the specific methodology or follow the specific methodology for collecting your data. So are you going to do quantitative data collection, surveys, etc., or are you going to do more qualitative? Are you going to conduct interviews? How are you going to collect the data? Some of this will be, figured out through the purpose stage as well as the research plan stage, but then you're actually going to go out and start collecting the data. And then finally, you're going to analyze and interpret that data, right? Well, there's one more step coming, but that's the important step, is really analyzing, trying to understand the data and interpreting it. So what is this data going to tell me about the problem that my organization is facing, okay? Then you'll probably report the findings. So that will be up to you as to what would be the best fit for that. Generally speaking, we see a lot of reports. Sometimes we'll see reports with data visualizations that really bring the information to life. But if you've decided to go with a more non-traditional methodology, let's say, that might lead to different types of knowledge dissemination. So once you've conducted this research and you have these findings, it is really important to leverage that into it's really important to leverage that and use it in the best way you can to improve your services. And finally, I think documenting the research process, that's really important too, right? So how did you go through those stages? Did you go through them in one particular order? Usually we do, but you may find that you got to the data collection stage and you weren't able to find anyone who was willing to talk to you. So maybe you had to rethink about how you were going to answer your research questions, right? So we know things happen. We know sometimes there's more populations that are more difficult to talk to or difficult to do research with, right? So you might have to find yourself pivoting to different ways of collecting data. So documenting those things that you struggle with as you're doing research is really important. So often time is a constraint, right? So you may find time's a constraint. Maybe you need to give more of a financial incentive to people to participate in your research. So you really want to make sure that you're documenting that research process. And that also is something you can learn from for next time, right? So that's really an important part. I would strongly suggest, if you do have a problem or a research question, try to connect with a local organization and a local university or college in your area. They likely will have a researcher who's interested in some of the issues that you're interested in and will be able to provide and support methodology and shape kind of your survey or your interview questions in a way that will make it even stronger. So it's great. We work at CHASI, we work with community organizations all the time that will come to us with research problems. And while they are often the experts because they're the ones providing the services to their constituents and to their clients, we are able to come in with kind of this expertise and support that way. So I would strongly suggest you reach out to different organizations and institutions that might be able to support the research questions that you have and help you kind of with this research process, because it's not always straightforward. That's why I say it's a process, but it's not always linear. So it's really important to be flexible because you just never know what might come up in the research process.
Thank you so much for joining us for this webinar. We hope that you're able to take back some lessons learned to your organization, and you can really integrate research to improve your services and help solve community problems. If you would like to speak with us about anything you've learned in this webinar or anything further, we're happy to be in touch. Please contact the Community Health and Social Innovation Hub through the email, and we look forward to hearing from you.